Spilt Milk, Thriving in the Wake of Narcissistic Abuse is an autobiographical synopsis of my second marriage. Sharing my story as a form of therapy of sorts. As I ruminated on the path I traveled in life and love, what challenged me the most was my need to make sense of this incredibly painful ordeal. What makes psychological abuse so insidious is the effect it has on the subconscious mind. Like a cancerous tumor, the psychological scathe goes undetected until the damage is done, and the emotional trauma has metastasized throughout the victim's psyche. During the course of my marriage, I was frequently reminded that God hates divorce. But then again, God also hates lying, manipulation, deception, gaslighting, dishonest scales, and the like. Yet, for the sake of my marriage, as far as it depended upon me, I made every effort to please or appease my duplicitous spouse. While my first marriage lasted nearly 8 years, my second would last less than 8 months. We dated for more than a year and a half before we were married. Yet 7 months later, we were officially separated. Still, my decision to divorce my wife was not based on her initial deception, but rather in response to her unrepentant acts of psychological and emotional abuse. God will never let the suffering of the faithful go to waste. So, how have I grown through this experience? And what wisdom can I impart to encourage or inspire others? Perhaps we can explore this question together as I share my story of not merely surviving psychological and emotional abuse, but thriving in the wake of it. In this life, you'll have tribulation isn't merely a sagacious aphorism, but a sobering promise. The painful truth is, hurt people invariably hurt people. We're all broken, and to some extent, we're all endeavoring to mitigate our own hurts, habits, and hang-ups, usually at the expense of those we profess to love the most. He who finds a wife finds a good thing was the chant I heard countless times during my seemingly dry and fruitless dating seasons. Nevertheless, this mantra would inevitably become my heartfelt anthem, despite nearly a decade of close calls and near misses, as I fastidiously dodged Cupid's poisoned arrows while treading lightly through a minefield of emotionally explosive would-be love interests. I've often said that drama on the big screen can be immensely entertaining. However, drama in relationships is both disheartening and emotionally exhausting, whether sparring with an overbearing in-law or trading blows with a delusive and duplicitous spouse. Nevertheless, despite years of heartache and mind-numbing dejection, I remained hopelessly optimistic that genuine love, and lots of it, was still a worthwhile pursuit, albeit not for the faint of heart. Even those of us looking for love in all the right places should consider the hurts, habits, and hang-ups of those with whom we hope to cultivate relationships and eventually marry, whether we're avoiders, pleasers, vacillators, victims, controllers, or any amalgamation of these 5 core patterns. We would do well to gain some insight as to how our individual love styles may impact or possibly trigger others. For the record, love styles are not personality types. And the How We Love tools and materials are not at all designed or intended to detect or diagnose personality disorders. In their book, How We Love, Mylan and Kay Yogovich explain exactly how each person's childhood experiences form the root of who they are, and how their core patterns continue to inform the way they respond to others and express love far into adulthood. Of course, the objective for those willing to do the work is to ultimately develop or mature into what Mylan and Kay characterize as a secure connector. In the wake of some very hard-learned lessons, I became acutely aware of just how entwined my own mental and emotional health was, not only with that of the women I dated, but ultimately with that of the woman I would eventually come to marry. What made How We Love such an invaluable resource was that it illuminated many of the emotional injuries influencing my own behavior. In my book, A Glass Half Full, A Loving Husband's Bout with Mental Illness, I share my story as a devoted husband and primary caregiver to my first wife and most intimate friend, who struggled with the challenges associated with mental illness. She would ultimately seek a divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Nevertheless, those closest to us might have characterized our narrative as a cross between Jeremy Levin's The Notebook and Sylvia Nahr's A Beautiful Mind. Even after our divorce, we remained close. In fact, we frequently entertained the possibility of getting back together. Sadly, however, my ex-wife remained fiercely opposed to my having any input whatsoever regarding her psychiatric medications and treatment. Consequently, for the sake of my own mental and emotional well-being, remarrying my dearest friend would not have been a wise or prudent choice for me, which made moving on an extremely painful but necessary resolution. After years of self-reflection, which included several months of grief counseling and at least 2 rounds of the divorce care workshop, I was ready to throw my proverbial hat back into the dating ring. I would subsequently spar with dozens of potential spouses afore my infamous rumble in the jungle, i.e., my second marriage, which is, of course, the primary subject of this book. Albeit few of my sparring partners were as forbidding as Left Hook Lisa. This hard-hitting powerhouse was a never-married, undefeated, high-end controller vacillator. She was a towering 5 feet, 6 inches in heels, weighed in at 115 pounds, soaking wet, and was 10 years my junior. But don't let appearances fool you. Although petite, this smart, attractive, and very successful southpaw packed a wicked punch. According to Mylan and Kay Yogovich, quote, controllers need to control to ensure that the vulnerable negative feelings they experienced in childhood remain suppressed. Having control means having protection from feelings of fear, humiliation, and helplessness. Anger is, however, one emotion that is not vulnerable, and so anger and intimidation are often used as a means to maintain control. With regards to the vacillator, without consistent parental affection, they develop feelings of abandonment, and by the time the parent feels like giving again, the child has grown tired of waiting and too angry to receive love or attention. As adults, vacillators are on a quest to find that consistent love they never received as a child. They idealize new relationships, but then grow tired of them once the relationship seems less than perfect. End quote. Ironically, it was Lisa who introduced me to the Love Styles quiz, which she asked me to take a few weeks or so into our budding relationship. Lisa and I formally met on a blind date. Lisa would later admit to surreptitiously orchestrating that date by prodding her friend, who facilitated the last divorce care workshop I attended, to gauge whether I might be willing to go out with her. Confused? Well, as it turns out, Lisa and I interacted briefly while she was volunteering at the information booth where I originally signed up for the divorce care workshop. It would have been about 8 weeks since that brief encounter, and honestly, I was flattered by her persistence and resourcefulness in bringing our blind date to fruition. However, despite my desperate attempts to employ the remedies that Mylan and Kay prescribed for our specific love style pairing, my relationship with Lisa would inevitably run its course. In one final fit of rage, Lisa spurned the very tools she introduced to help us avoid the disparaging patterns of behavior that eventually devastated our relationship. After more than a year, I would finally throw in the towel on what seemed a hopeless endeavor to placate her volatile propensities once triggered. As a recovering pleaser-avoider, I've subsequently pondered my own propensity to attract or gravitate toward the controller-vacillator type. Apparently, quote, controllers are often drawn to the avoider's even mood and low level of reactivity, while the avoider initially enjoys the convenience of someone else taking charge and making decisions, giving them the feeling of being cared for. Avoiders frequently overlook problems that might cause conflict, as intense negative emotions repel them, causing them to withdraw or clam up. Pleasers, on the other hand, attempt to keep everyone happy. However, if they feel that their efforts aren't valued or appreciated, this could lead to resentment, which breaks down the relationship and eventually provokes the pleaser to leave. End quote. Although my relationship with Lisa failed miserably, I learned a great deal from that experience. And while I would not summarily disqualify a controller or vacillator as a potential spouse, knowing the tendencies of these core patterns helped me to avoid many marital disasters. That is, of course, all except one. After a brief hiatus, I was back online swiping left when Blindside Betty reached out. It just so happened I viewed her profile a few weeks earlier, but wasn't compelled to connect. She was attractive enough. She seemed cultured, intelligent, and accomplished. In fact, the site matched us at 100% compatible, plus or minus a 68.9% margin of error. Betty was slightly older, with a 13-year-old son in tow. She described herself as extremely liberal, yet vehemently passionate regarding matters of faith and practice. To her credit, Betty graciously accepted my invitation to take the Love Styles quiz. And as fate would have it, she weighed in as a high-end controller vacillator. But as promised, I would not summarily disqualify her. Instead, I gave Betty the benefit of the doubt. Besides, she seemed pleasant enough, and I didn't find myself constantly on the ropes, ducking and weaving, as was the case with Left Hook Lisa. Still, chemistry and genuine compatibility mattered, so I continued to vet other matches while Betty and I became better acquainted. Next up, horoscope Helen. After viewing Helen's profile, I thought she seemed more my type. I reached out, and we quickly began chatting online, and then by phone. I eventually invited Helen to take the Love Styles quiz, as had become my custom. Surprisingly, she gracefully declined. Apparently, Helen didn't put much stock in these types of tests, per se. Besides, she was already convinced that we were both mentally and emotionally compatible, given I was a Capricorn and she a Virgo. I confess, my judgment was probably a bit clouded, given I found Helen extraordinarily attractive. That was, of course, judging from her profile photos. Over the course of several days, Helen and I had some very intriguing philosophical conversations, which, quite frankly, left me somewhat perplexed with regards to her worldview. Still enchanted, I gave Helen the benefit of the doubt and invited her to continue our conversation in real time over brunch or dinner. However, the night before our much-anticipated first date, Helen called to put me on notice. She stated that although I had been previously married, whatever I did to win my former wife's affection would not ingratiate me towards her. In fact, Helen insisted that if I expected to win her heart, I would have to, quote, step up my game, end quote. I'm not sure what or who set Helen off, but I was immediately put off and disillusioned by both her comment and her tone. I thought, oh my God, here we go again. This didn't sound at all like the gracious young woman I'd been chatting with these past few weeks. By the way, just for the record, with regards to my first wife, I won her heart and affection simply by being myself, honest, respectful, vulnerable, and unpretentious. I had absolutely no intention of showing up for anyone as anybody other than myself. Suffice it to say, Helen and I never spoke again. Still echoing in the back of my mind was a comment I heard at a singles retreat just a few months earlier. Men, they're all broken. Just pick one. After my recent experience with Helen, this statement resonated with me all the more. Sam, they're all broken. Just pick one. It was the perfect storm. At this point, I was exhausted. And given that Betty had been showing up as the most emotionally healthy woman I'd encountered thus far, I turned my attention towards her, and we pursued an exclusive relationship with the ultimate intention of marriage. There was nothing extraordinary about our courtship. It was pleasant, calm, seemed normal enough. We laughed, had inside jokes. We met each other's friends and family. Things seemed to be progressing nicely. About 6 months in, I proposed, and we began our march toward the altar. We started a series of premarital counseling sessions. We completed the usual surveys, we answered the questions, we read the books, and we talked through the tough topics like money, sex, and conflict resolution. However, not long after we were married, I discovered that Betty deliberately misrepresented herself. Apparently, she stepped up her game by showing up as the woman she believed I would want to marry versus the woman she actually was. Surprisingly, even my most trusted and valued vetting tools were ill-suited in helping me navigate the uncharted waters in which I found myself. It had been my experience that if you vetted someone long enough, their true colors would eventually show through. After all, this was certainly the case with all the other women I dated, from Left Hook Lisa to Horoscope Helen and every woman prior to and or in between. However, this didn't prove to be the case with Blindside Betty. Regardless of how astute I thought I had become in vetting potential matches, lying about who she was and what she genuinely believed wasn't at all something I'd expected. My eyes were wide open, and still, I never saw it coming. Blade Runner remains one of my all-time favorite cult film classics. A masterpiece. Dazzling, says New York Times' Joseph Gelmis. Quote, Rick Deckard, portrayed by Harrison Ford, prowls the still and microchip jungle of 21st century Los Angeles, stalking genetically synthesized criminal replicants. End quote. The dramatic opening scene sets the stage for an enthralling game of cat and mouse, as it's not always clear who's prey or predator. One of Deckard's most formidable tools of his trade is a remarkable engineering marvel he dispassionately refers to as Voight-Kampff, an empathy testing apparatus, frequently used to weed out replicants through a series of questions designed to provoke an emotional reaction. The device monitors and analyzes capillary dilation of the blush response, fluctuation of the pupil, and involuntary dilation of the iris, and is definitely a great deal more accurate in exposing aberrant dating prospects than was the online dating app where I met Betty. Can you envision a room full of these incredible devices, where potential dating prospects sit face to face directly across from one another, exchanging scrutinizing questions with complete confidence that their very own Voight-Kampff would weed out any potentially abusive dating prospects, which would undoubtedly propel speed dating to an entirely new paradigm. Unfortunately, I did not have access to such an amazing contraption. Psychotherapist and licensed counselor Dr. Avery Neal poses several emotionally charged questions in a recently published Counseling Today article entitled, Does Your Personality Make You More Vulnerable to Abuse? She goes on to ask her readers several introspective questions that those of us who've experienced abuse would do well to gingerly consider. First, am I naive or inexperienced? Am I overly responsible? Am I highly empathetic? Lastly, do I avoid conflict at any cost? Dr. Neal surmises, quote, recognizing our blind spots and vulnerabilities is arguably a requisite for healing and self-care, affording one an opportunity to self-correct or at least mitigate unhealthy patterns that make us more vulnerable or susceptible to abuse. End quote. Betty and I were married on a temperate summer's day. Clear blue skies, for at least as far as I could see. Our garden ceremony was a picture-perfect occasion. The aroma of fresh blossoms filled the air as Betty walked intently down the aisle. Here comes the bride. Our guest enthusiastically looked on with anticipation. Betty's mother was staring straight at me, while talking under her breath just loud enough for those sitting close enough to hear her mutter, quote, "That poor man has no idea what he's getting into," end quote. Of course, I didn't catch wind of this prophetic lament until well after I had already filed for divorce, nearly 7 months later. Both mentally and emotionally disheveled, and still having no idea what I'd gotten into. Those of us who grew up in the 70s should remember the then popular television sitcom Leave It to Beaver. If not, I'm sure Google and/or YouTube can bring you up to speed. In this classic ABC television series, there was a character by the name of Eddie Haskell, the best friend of Beaver Cleaver's older brother, Wally. Eddie Haskell presented as empathetic, kind-hearted, clean-cut, and very well-mannered. Was he a covert narcissist? Who knows? Especially given that narcissism typically goes undiagnosed. Albeit Eddie did exhibit narcissistic tendencies. Much like the covert narcissist, Eddie Haskell was a master of manipulation. And like the infamous Dr. Jekyll, he too was well adept at concealing his less attractive alter ego. Quote, "A covert narcissist is a person who has narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, yet doesn't display the grandiose sense of self-importance. Such a person can be characterized as the quiet counterpart to the grandiose narcissist. The covert narcissist may appear shy, modest, or lack self-confidence by comparison. Researchers frequently refer to these individuals as vulnerable narcissists. Nevertheless, both types of NPD share the same traits, such as a need for admiration and a lack of empathy." End quote. Love bombing is a tactic typically used to quickly win the affection of a person of interest. Reflecting on the 1.5 years of love bombing that Betty subjected me to, I've often asked myself, what did I miss? How in the world could I have been so blind? So if you've had a similar experience with an Eddie Haskell or blindside Betty of your own, please don't beat yourself up. Because contrary to popular belief, even hindsight isn't always 20/20. Roughly 3 months into our courtship, Betty asked for my input regarding a rent-to-own leasing agreement she negotiated prior to our having met. "Sam, I really want you to come see this place. After all, it's where we'll be living once we're married." To be honest, her comment struck me as a little premature, given we hadn't actually discussed or agreed on our future living arrangements. However, to her credit, Betty made no secret of her original plan to moved from her current residence into a more affluent single-family dwelling, supposedly because her landlord had become a bit neglectful regarding routine maintenance and repairs, despite her having been a loyal tenant for more than 15 years. Betty's new dream home was a large, 5-bedroom palatial palace featuring a 2-car garage, a basement party room with a full-size bar, hardwood flooring throughout, and enough backyard for an in-ground swimming pool, just for fun. It was a beautiful home in a beautiful neighborhood, but it was a lot more house than I was comfortable with, especially given I was 57 and she 58 with a teenage son heading off to college in a few short years. As we toured the house, the first thought that came to my mind was, who's going to cut the grass? Besides, I already owned a more spacious and aesthetically appealing townhome than the one Betty had been renting these past few years. It was also a great deal closer to the private school her son was currently attending, which would have saved us thousands of dollars a year in shuttle fees alone. All things considered, it made little sense to me that we should be considering a 30-year mortgage this close to retirement. Frankly speaking, I wasn't looking forward to spending the remainder of my life struggling to pay a mortgage while clipping AARP coupons or haggling for a senior's discount at my favorite restaurant. Not at all the future I envisioned at 65. Of course, Betty assured me this wouldn't be the case. Don't worry, Sam. I make more than enough money for the both of us, and the income from my practice will continue well beyond our retirement. Was Betty stating what she genuinely believed to be true? Or was she simply future faking? In either case, I wasn't willing to sell my house just to rent someone else's. That was a huge backward financial misstep from my perspective. There are few mountains I'm willing to die on, but this was definitely one of them. A non-negotiable I would have fiercely defended right up to the bitter end. However, as it so happened, our first major disagreement did not end in a full-out, no-hose-barred cage match, but rather in what I believe to have been an equitable compromise. Betty would remain another year in the house she was already renting. Then, after we were married, I would sell my house, and she and I would purchase a new home in the area she was currently living. One brief side note, definitely worth mentioning. During our courtship, I visited Betty virtually every evening and quickly noticed that housekeeping wasn't one of her strong suits, an issue she attributed to simply being a busy soccer mom. Because acts of service is one of my primary love languages, I found myself quickly becoming her de facto maintenance man, janitor, and part-time housekeeper. In fact, on one occasion, I spent my entire day cleaning and organizing Betty's house while she and her mother went shopping. I never thought of myself as the obsessive-compulsive type. However, dirt, grime, and clutter are definitely to me as kryptonite is to Superman. So I confess this particular act of service was more for me than it was for her. Betty was without question the Oscar Madison to my Felix Unger, which became a major point of conflict in several of our premarital counseling sessions, during which she frequently dismissed me as being a tad bit overreactive. It was never my intention to embarrass Betty, so I felt documenting her excessively messy or hoarding tendencies would have been for a loving husband to be. a serious breach of etiquette. In retrospect, however, I regret not having taken pictures. Betty and I were married in late May, but because the house she rented was too small and too cluttered to comfortably accommodate the three of us, I continued living in the home I already owned and stayed at Betty's on the weekends. I admit it wasn't an ideal arrangement, but in the interim, we were committed to making it work. With barely 6 months remaining on her lease, house shopping became our top priority. Once we came to a consensus on the size, price, and location of our new dwelling, Betty wasted no time sending me listings of all the homes she found appealing, many of which I really liked. The prospect of our finding a new home together was initially exciting. However, after spending the next 2 months just looking, with no apparent end in sight, the whole process began to feel a bit pointless. We weren't working with a realtor, nor had we pre-qualified for a mortgage of any amount. So, had we found the ideal home, we weren't at all prepared to make a credible offer. Given Betty had never owned a home, I figured in the excitement of shopping for one, this simple yet necessary requisite must have slipped her mind. So I decided to reach out to a mortgage broker to at least initiate the process. Albeit I did not expect the vehement pushback and scathing interrogation that Betty unleashed after the lender requested copies of our financial statements. "Why'd you contact a mortgage company? And why'd you pick this one?" I was genuinely confused by Betty's reaction. After all, for this incurably pragmatic INTJ, it stood to reason. We can't buy a house together without a mortgage, unless you have $500,000 stashed away somewhere that I don't know about. Betty hesitantly responded, "No, I don't have $500,000 stashed away." Although she never apologized for her impertinent outburst, her silence spoke volumes. A few days later, while Betty was out of town visiting family, I received a call from the lender. "I've got great news, Mr. Wright. You've been tentatively approved. Given your excellent credit, along with the current value of your existing home, a $450,000 mortgage is definitely doable. I've already talked it over with your wife, and there's just one minor detail. Since your credit is so much better than hers, we should go with you." He paused. "Just to be clear," I asked, "so then I should be the primary?" "Well, actually, Mr. Wright, we shouldn't use your wife on the loan at all." "Wait, what?" "It's my wife's income that's driving this loan. She makes well over $100,000 a year." "Perhaps, but according to her tax returns, she makes roughly $30,000 a year. She has more than $50,000 in student loan debt, in addition to other adverse information on her credit report, which makes her a huge lending risk. You can always add her name to the title of the house, but if you use her on the loan, I promise you won't qualify." There was an awkward silence. As I took a breath and asked, "What kind of adverse information?" He replied, "I'm sorry, Mr. Wright, but legally I can't tell you that." At this point, it was apparent that he was just as perplexed and disoriented as I was. So much so, he asked me candidly, "You two are married, right?" I was so emotionally disheveled that I couldn't even answer his question. I just stammered. I'll have to call you back. As I hung up the phone, I was immediately bombarded by a myriad of intense thoughts and feelings. A frenzied combination of punches that left me dazed and staggering on the ropes. Then in one final jaw-quivering blow, my mouthpiece hurled through the air as my face met the mat. I was out and down for the count. The revelation that Betty had been lying all the while about her grossly inflated or dubiously understated income to her jacked up credit was more than I could process. Who is this woman? And what else has she been lying about? Once more, having already betrayed my trust, how in the world could this woman have the audacity to expect me to assume sole responsibility for a $450,000 home mortgage while injudiciously adding her name to the title of the house? My God, was I nothing more to Betty than a mark? I was just starting to regain my composure when my phone rang. It was Betty, calling from out of town. I wasn't in the mood to speak to her, so I let the call go straight to voicemail. The next day, I texted. I spoke with Linda, and I need more time to process. Needless to say, she didn't respond, albeit her silence spoke volumes. Once Betty returned from her trip, we agreed to meet at her office because she didn't want to risk having a heated argument in front of her son. Struggling to make sense of what the mortgage lender told me, I asked Betty several probing questions. However, her responses were vague and deflecting. Eventually, I asked Betty straight out, "So what exactly is in your credit report which makes you such a huge lending risk?" She stared straight at me, shrugged her shoulders, but said nothing. I eventually grew tired of guessing, as it became apparent that the only way I'd find out was if I pulled her credit report myself. Then, without any expression of remorse or admission of guilt, Betty asked, in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "Do you want a divorce?" It seemed as though she was trying to determine just how much crazy I'd be willing to tolerate. To be honest, divorce was the furthest thing from my mind because in that moment, all I wanted was the truth. Before I married Betty, I thought gaslighting was just an antiquated way to illuminate the house. In fact, I was completely oblivious to terms such as love bombing, narcissistic supply, narcissistic injury, trauma bonding, hoovering, flying monkeys, and the like. Still, I'd be amiss if I failed to mention that in my subsequent research, I discovered that terms or pseudo-diagnoses such as narcissistic victim syndrome, trauma-associated narcissistic symptoms, and post-traumatic narcissism syndrome aren't found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DMS-5, presumably because such constructs inappropriately ascribe a clinical diagnosis to the abuser without actually having clinically assessed them. And while I don't profess to be an expert on covert narcissism, I have experienced the very real and visceral effects of psychological and emotional abuse. And while not every individual experiences or processes this abuse in exactly the same way, it's safe to say those unfortunate enough to have been subjected to it are inevitably affected by it, to some degree. Quote, idealization, devaluation, and discarding is the cycle that many abusers oscillate through during the course of their relationships. In the midst of an ongoing cycle of abuse, it's difficult for victims to verbalize or process what they're experiencing, as abusers twist and warp reality to suit their own ends, idealizing their victims over and over after abusive incidents. In many cases, convincing the victim themselves that they're to blame. Victims of psychological and emotional abuse often feel mentally exhausted, depressed, controlled, and constantly on edge, even after the relationship has ended. End quote. So, what's love got to do with it? Clinical neuropsychologist and cognitive neuroscience author Rhonda Friedman explains several common reactions that occur in the brain in response to abuse and how these reactions actually work against the victim. Quote, there are many reasons someone may violate a person they profess to love. For example, substance or alcohol abuse, a neurological condition impacting behavior, or a disorganization of character, such as narcissistic personality disorder. In many cases, victims will find it nearly impossible to walk away. The neurochemistry of love and attachment, especially in the presence of abuse, could sentence a victim to a grim future with a malignant partner. Dr. Friedman goes on to explain that several important ingredients contributing to one's addiction to a toxic partner are oxytocin, bonding, endogenous opioids, pleasure, pain, withdrawal, dependence, corticotropin releasing factor, withdrawal, stress, and dopamine, craving, seeking, wanting. In the presence of such a profound addiction, there'll be intense craving, a heightened value attributed to the abuser, and a hyper-focus on the relationship and conflict resolution. The victim will attempt to make sense of these feelings, and the brain usually turns to self-deception and rationalization to resolve the cognitive dissonance. With such strong neurochemistry in dysregulated states, it's not surprising why it would be extremely difficult to manage one's emotions, let alone make rational or logical decisions. End quote. Despite Betty's initial pretense, it was now apparent that our purchasing a new home together was never a viable option. In retrospect, Betty was the only one not genuinely surprised when we failed to qualify for a mortgage. Nevertheless, I was intent on working through our current housing crises, while at the same time trying to establish some semblance of trust and accountability. What ultimately frustrated Betty was my reaffirmation of our original compromise. While she typically played fast and loose with the truth, I've always been a man of my word. So despite Betty's constant nagging, selling my house just to rent someone else's was never gonna happen. Over the next few months, our financial situationship had gone from bad to worse to even worser, defying both logic and grammar. At this point, not even America's critically acclaimed financial guru, Dave Ramsey, could persuade Betty that moving into the townhome I already owned was the wisest and most prudent step forward towards financial peace, allowing us to drastically reduce expenses, pay off massive debt, and rebuild her appalling credit. Still, Betty remained stubbornly intent on projecting a facade of prosperity and affluence, no matter what it cost me. Our first major disagreement had come full circle. We were at an impasse, and our honeymoon was over. Marriage and family therapist Michael Quirk points out that, quote, for most couples, when the honeymoon stage wears off, things begin to fall into a predictable pattern or routine. Of course, you still love your spouse, but that initial euphoria usually wears off. And yet, this is the time when most couples actually grow closer and learn how to effectively work together as partners. However, in the cycle of narcissistic abuse, this phase of the relationship is quite different. It's when the abusive spouse begins to devalue their partner instead of growing closer to them. For the narcissist, their partner is merely a source of supply, or a way by which to fuel their own agenda and self-image. In this phase, the abuser begins to degrade their partner in a manner that is so subtle and precise that it's extremely difficult for the abused spouse to consciously detect, let alone describe. In addition, abusers may deprive or starve their partner of affection as a means of manipulation. End quote. Emotional starvation can be defined as feelings of a strong emotional need, typically brought about by deprivation in childhood, having grown up without love or affection. In adults, this can manifest itself as an insatiable yearning for affirmation and emotional intimacy. It's not difficult to imagine how a malevolent individual might exploit this acute vulnerability. But what of an otherwise emotionally healthy adult who's being strategically deprived of affection as a means of manipulation? Dr. Todd Grande expounds upon this insidious tactic commonly employed by individuals with NPD. He explains that, quote, narcissism is not at all complex, but actually self-centered and childish in terms of the way narcissistic traits manifest themselves, as self-serving and immature. The complex part of the personality never really gets to develop when narcissism is present. In fact, you could actually argue that everyone starts out narcissistic, and most people develop out of it and become more complex and sensitive, while others remain trapped. What we see with individuals with NPD is that they're protecting themselves behind the wall of narcissism. So the lack of affection, depth, and sensitivity really doesn't affect them because they're shielded from it by their narcissism. With regards to their expressing affection toward their spouse, it simply boils down to they won't, because it's actually part of their manipulation. However, with respect to genuine sensitivity and emotional intimacy, for the narcissist, the reality is they can't, because it's simply not part of their programming. Individuals with NPD literally lack the capacity to connect that deeply and authentically. End quote. Even those of us who haven't raised children ourselves are probably familiar with that age and stage of life commonly referred to as the terrible twos. And for those of us who have faced the wrath of a teething toddler, we'd more likely than not agree with Dr. Grande that as human beings, we all start out as narcissistic. StopTheSpinCycle.com graphically illustrates the conceptualization that narcissism runs the spectrum from normal to pathological, with varying noxious gradations in between. In a peer-reviewed Psychology Today article, Dr. Susan Diggs White notes that, quote, About 10% of the population suffers from a long-lasting and fairly entrenched behavioral pattern or diagnosable personality disorder. Moreover, those diagnosed with disorders such as borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder may, in many cases, reduce their behavioral symptoms through therapy or drug treatment, but aren't at all likely to mitigate these entrenched behavior patterns on their own. End quote. As for those of us hoping to avoid becoming ensnared in a psychologically or emotionally unhealthy relationship, Dr. Diggs-White reminds us that, quote, we're all attracted to different people for various reasons. But if someone's behavior seems a little too different or peculiar, don't dismiss your gut instincts. Otherwise, disappointment is what you'll most likely find, as opposed to the enduring happiness you may be seeking. End quote. I grew up in an age of contagious imagination, where Saturday morning superheroes never failed to save the day. So it's not surprising I'm a huge Marvels and DC Comics fan. Can you imagine waking up one morning to discover you've been miraculously endowed with incredible strength and agility? Perhaps the ability to fly, or leap tall buildings in a single bound. Shocked and amazed with your newly acquired superpowers, I'd imagine, if we're honest, few of us would earnestly seek immediate medical attention in hopes to be cured and subsequently restored to our non-super selves. Especially if we've ever had the misfortune of being habitually bullied or abused, which might explain why so few narcissists seek treatment. Because in their mind, their narcissism is their superpower. A concept Dr. Phil Calvin McGraw, aka Dr. Phil, so cogently delineates in a recent podcast. In her book, Love in Every Season, licensed professional counselor and author Deborah Feeder shares, quote, like plants, relationships require a pattern of giving and taking in order for them to grow. If you're in a relationship in which you're constantly giving and taking nothing in return, your relationship will eventually stop growing. Conversely, if you're in a relationship in which you're doing all the taking and giving nothing, your relationship will soon die. This type of pattern cannot be maintained in nature or in relationships. Relationships have to be made up of just the right amount of giving and taking. Healthy relationships require mutual encouragement and edification. It's a two-way street. Give and take. But unfortunately, many of us are in relationships that are only one way. One-way relationships consist of two people, but only one person is doing most of the work. No matter who's doing the giving or taking, it always takes two people to keep them going. Behind every one-way relationship, there's a person who continues to make excuses, a person who continues to see the relationship for what it could be, rather than seeing it for what it actually is. For some of us, the idea of setting limits and boundaries in our lives is hard to grasp. We see love as an unconditional aspect of relationships. And rightly so, but loving someone does not mean allowing them to have a free pass to do whatever they want, whenever they want, without consequences. Love does not mean that we enable an unhealthy relationship, allowing someone to take advantage of us, to hurt and abuse us repeatedly. Not only is giving too much unhealthy for the giver, it's also unhealthy for the taker, fueling a pattern of dysfunction rather than calling those in that relationship to a better place. It enables the taker to continue behaving in a harmful way without challenging them to get healthy." End quote. A month or so before our wedding, Betty had me feeling, as they say, some kind of way. Albeit I typically dismissed these troubling premonitions by convincing myself I most likely misinterpreted her behavior, or was being, as she put it, a tad bit overreactive. Still, I have heard rumors of runaway brides and grooms who had succumbed to suppressed fear and high anxiety on that fateful day. Unfortunately for me, however, my visceral reaction would not occur until several hours after I had already said, "I do." Far too late to have been of any consequence. In fact, I vividly recall sitting on a brown leather couch in the upstairs lobby of the restaurant hosting our reception. As I was paying the bill, it hit me. A paralyzing, gut-wrenching sensation, accompanied by the thought, "Oh my God, I've made a horrible mistake." What an awful thing to think of my new bride. I felt even worse for having thought it. Still, I walked around in a mental haze for the remainder of that day. That very evening, while driving back to the hotel to join Betty and her family for dinner, I unintentionally missed several highway exits, adding an additional 40 minutes to what should have been a short 15-minute trip. Sadly, over the next few months, Betty would perniciously progress from one outrageous exploit to the next. In fact, for nearly our entire marriage, she kept me in a perpetual state of psychological and emotional vertigo. So all I wanted that year for Christmas was to stop the room from spinning. After Betty's lease expired, she hounded me to sell my house, yet still insisting I had no say as to where she and her son should live. A far cry from, "Sam, I really want you to come see this place," just a few months prior. As I stacked boxes of her belongings against the two-car garage walls of her newly rented dwelling, it suddenly occurred to me that I was punch drunk and barely hanging on to a very large knot that I tied to the end of what was now a very short rope. So while detached involvement, or emotionally distancing myself from the consequences of Betty's actions, might have proven helpful if we were merely co-workers in an office setting, but as her husband, not so much. Even after helping Betty move, in spite of my misgivings, she made a point to tell me to my face she wasn't happy, which in light of her malcontent didn't catch me totally by surprise. Still, she was constantly berating me as though, metaphorically speaking, I were actually responsible for the subsequent swelling and bruising of her fists and knuckles after she repeatedly punched me in the face. All things considered, Betty's behavior was, in the words or word of one of boxing's greatest legends, ludicrous. That evening, I told Betty that I'd be taking some much-needed time away to clear my head. No more than a week or two, or so I thought. It never occurred to me that this would be the last time I would ever see her, apart from a Zoom divorce proceeding, amidst a worldwide pandemic. My initial time away from Betty was an incredibly refreshing respite. Fortunately for me, I hadn't sold my house, where I spent a fair amount of time engaged in quiet introspection, evaluating and reconciling my cognitive discomfort. I was, after all, conflicted. My marriage to Betty felt anything but loving. In fact, after several therapeutic rounds of she loves me not, I would eventually replace the wedding band that Betty gave me with the band I kept from my first marriage. A tangible reminder of what requited love should feel like, which was not at all what I'd been experiencing with Betty, who had by this time already reached out to Pastor Stewart, who officiated our dysfunctional union. Betty told him that I'd abandoned her and her young son. Surprisingly, I was still inclined to reconciling, and actually looked forward to meeting with Pastor Stewart, who I believed would have been an impartial and objective referee. Betty adamantly insisted that we meet with him together, but this time around, I wasn't giving her the benefit of the doubt. She knew exactly how to push my buttons, so I wasn't about to give her an opportunity to provoke me in front of Pastor Stewart. I did, however, agree to meet with him alone. Pastor Stewart, our discussion this past Sunday was extremely helpful. It left me hopeful and optimistic that with your help, Betty and I might finally begin to move past the dysfunction plaguing our marriage. That was, of course, before I discovered she helped herself to virtually every penny in our joint savings account without my knowledge or consent. Just another sad example of the blatant disregard and disrespect I've been enduring. Who does that? What kind of loving, respectful, and devoted spouse does that? At our first meeting, you asserted that trust is the foundation of every healthy and enduring relationship, which begs the question, how in the world can you do life or build anything meaningful with someone you can't trust? The more we spoke, the more obvious it became that when Betty met with you, she deliberately omitted key facts that might have given you a clear, unbiased view of what was actually going on with us. Instead, she falsely depicted me as an overreactive, hyper-emotional spouse who gets angry, yells, and then storms out for no apparent reason. Pastor Stewart, I sincerely appreciate your efforts. I truly do. I also regret the situation in which Betty and I now find ourselves. However, this relationship has long since become toxic and detrimental to my mental and emotional well-being. I honestly see no reason to waste any more of your valuable time on our failed marriage, when there's so many troubled marriages out there actually worth saving. Yes, I know. God hates divorce. And so do I. I always assumed that Betty loved me. Yet, in retrospect, I'm not convinced. Besides, she seldom, if ever, told me so. Although there was that one occasion when she admitted that all her life she saw men as merely objects to be used. and never thought she'd ever find true love. She made no direct eye contact before or after having shared this conspicuous revelation. She didn't reach out to touch or hold my hand. In fact, it felt more like a spontaneous confession, albeit her admission was profoundly honest, while at the same time awkwardly devoid of any feeling or emotion. I am convinced, however, that she most certainly loved the idea of being loved. No doubt she was intoxicated with what she perceived to be the quintessential life, the fabulous home, the perfect spouse, and the praise and admiration of her peers. Both Lisa and Betty were, as you may recall, high-end controller vacillators. Yet, in many respects, the two were polar opposites. Lisa was honest, loyal, demonstratively affectionate, and empathetic to a fault. While Betty, on the other hand, was typically aloof, self-focused, and incredibly manipulative. By the way, did I fail to mention she held an advanced degree in clinical psychology? In fact, I've often allegorized her as the main antagonist, O'Brien, portrayed by Richard Burton in the cinematic adaptation of George Orwell's classic novel, 1984, wherein O'Brien was tasked with literally dismantling and reconstructing Winston's psyche by twisting and distorting his perception of reality. Sound familiar? Despite his showing incredible resilience, by the end of his excruciatingly painful ordeal, the main protagonist, Winston Smith, would find himself trauma bonding to his abuser. But unlike Winston, I had successfully resolved my cognitive dissonance, which would actually make me more like Neil Anderson in the blockbuster sci-fi thriller The Matrix. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Morpheus. All four of Betty's siblings endured an incredibly arduous childhood, although she and her older sister's experience was especially traumatic. Prior to our marriage, I was unaware of all the sordid details. Suffice it to say, the abuse they suffered was both disheartening and ongoing. Oddly, I'd always gotten along well with Betty's mother, and I suppose in her own subtle way, she tried to warn me. On one occasion, she shared a few of Betty's childhood exploits, the most notable of which included Betty and her older sister deliberately burning down their house. Yeah. In the future, I'll definitely pay closer attention to these types of not-so-subtle details. I won't spend the balance of our time sharing each and every one of Betty's exploits, albeit there were many. Even now, she was intent on doing what she wanted, when she wanted, however she wanted. So whether I was on board or not, her ship was gonna sail, with or without me. In retrospect, our failing to qualify for a mortgage together was, for me, a blessing in disguise, especially given that Betty was in many ways still burning down the house. Marriage was never intended to break us. It is, for sure, however, a means by which God refines us, producing in and working through us joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. After all's been said and done, I have no animosity towards Betty. On the contrary, I've genuine compassion for the abused and frightened child she was, and empathy for the emotionally wounded woman I knew her to be, albeit only she and God can speak to the woman she might prayerfully become. We've all heard stories of enchanted beasts, beauties, toads, and even Shrek finding the love of his life and living happily ever after. While these heartfelt fables may permeate our imaginations, in the end, they're little more than fantasies. In reality, there are no magic potions, spells, or incantations that can guarantee a happily ever after ending to our stories. The term spilt milk is an idiom for a bad event that has already happened. It vividly illustrates the futility of constantly rehearsing events or circumstances that can't be changed. The term originates from Welsh historian and author James Howell's Proverbs, published in 1659, although the phrase has undergone various reiterations since. Experience has taught that marriage is hard. Of course, it's even harder if you're married to a narcissist. So my use of this metaphor is not at all to suggest we shouldn't grieve or mourn in the wake of hardship or trauma. Conversely, it's my hope to encourage survivors like myself not to lose heart or become paralyzed by guilt or regret. In other words, I pray that God grants us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can, and of course, the wisdom to know the difference. Spilt Milk, Thriving in the Wake of Narcissistic Abuse, written and narrated by Samuel Wright, copyright 2025.